began with a phone call that, to the trained ear of a 911 dispatcher, just didn't sit right. The voice on the line was calm, eerily so, precise, almost clinical, as if reading from a checklist rather than calling in sheer panic. It was 6:54 a.m. on Monday, June 19, 2023, when Harold Green, a 67-year-old retiree from Cedar Ridge, Oregon, reported that his wife of 40 years, Marjorie Green, hadn't returned from her usual morning walk. He said she'd left just after 6 and was likely somewhere along her usual trail. But there was no real fear in his voice, no desperation, no tremor of uncertainty that typically laces the voices of spouses reporting the worst. It would take weeks, interviews, search warrants, electronic tracing, autopsy reports, and testimony from friends and family for investigators to understand that the truth behind that call was darker than anything they initially imagined. The marriage of Harold and Marge had long been the envy of their quiet community, the kind of small-town couple people trusted instinctively. They had been together since high school, married in 1982, raised 2 children, built a life marked by consistency and quiet middle-class comfort. Harold had spent most of his career as a mechanical engineer before retiring in 2020, and Marge, once a devoted elementary school teacher, had left the classroom behind in 2016. They owned a modest but well-kept home on the wooded edge of town, surrounded by hydrangeas and trimmed hedges, and they were the type to organize holiday food drives and host block parties where Harold handled the grill and Marge brought her signature lemon bars. But behind the image of domestic ease was something more brittle, something most only noticed in hindsight. Their daughter Ellen, now 38, would later tell investigators that while her parents rarely fought in front of others, her mother had recently seemed subdued, distracted, even afraid. In April of that year, Marge had quietly resumed journaling after decades of not doing so, pages that would eventually be submitted as evidence, offering raw, private insight into a mind growing increasingly uneasy. In one entry from late May, she wrote, "Harold doesn't look at me the way he used to. Sometimes, I think he's looking right through me." Neighbors, too, had started to notice. One, Deborah Hill, a 64-year-old retiree living 2 doors down, told police she'd heard shouting coming from the Green residence twice in early June, which stood out because she hadn't heard either of them raise their voice in years. In retrospect, the signs were there, small, disjointed pieces of a puzzle no one thought to assemble until it was too late. Harold, by all accounts, had been emotionally distant in the final year, often disappearing for the day with vague explanations, claiming he needed space or was heading into town without elaborating. Marge, on the other hand, had begun speaking quietly, cautiously, about the possibility of separation. According to Ellen, her mother feared that after decades together, they had grown into different people. But she worried what divorce would do to the family and whether Harold could handle it. She wasn't just being sentimental. She had reason to fear. Harold had always been meticulous, controlled, slow to anger, but once provoked, even mildly, he could turn cold. Those who knew him well described him as a man who liked things done a certain way and didn't tolerate deviation. No one expected the call that morning, but in hindsight, some admitted they weren't wholly surprised, either. Still, what shocked everyone wasn't just that Marge had vanished, but what Harold would do less than 24 hours after allegedly bludgeoning his wife to death in their bedroom and burying her in a forest nearly 100 miles away. He fired up the grill, invited the family over, and hosted a Father's Day barbecue as though nothing at all had changed. The version of events Harold Green provided to police was simple, clean, and ultimately unverifiable. Marge, he claimed, had woken up early on Saturday, June 17th, laced up her sneakers, and left the house for her usual morning walk sometime around 6:15 a.m. But as investigators would quickly discover, not a single neighbor spotted her that morning, and there were no surveillance cameras along the neighborhood routes she usually favored, no sightings, no motion-triggered doorbell footage, no corroboration. More suspiciously, Marge's smartwatch had been left charging on her nightstand, something her daughter Ellen described as odd to the point of impossible. Since Marge used it every morning to track her steps and heart rate, part of her health routine after a mild heart scare in 2021. Her phone, too, had remained at home. Early assumptions leaned toward foul play, though police initially refrained from saying so publicly. But one detail that did leak from the initial search warrant request was that Harold's behavior immediately after her disappearance didn't match the profile of a distressed husband. Rather than alerting neighbors or frantically searching, Harold reportedly left home that very afternoon and drove to a hardware store in Springfield, 35 miles away. Receipts, later subpoenaed, showed a cash purchase at 3:42 p.m. for a 50-pound bag of lime, a package of heavy-duty contractor trash bags, and a bundle of industrial zip ties. Security camera footage from the store's garden supply section showed Harold alone, dressed casually, wearing gloves, and spending almost 10 minutes staring at different bagged limes before selecting the most expensive brand. When asked about this errand during an early interview, Harold explained he was planning yard work. But when investigators canvassed the Green property days later, they noted that not only was no such work evident, but the items purchased were nowhere to be found. That Saturday evening, just hours after the purchase, Harold texted both his children and several extended family members with a breezy message. "Don't forget Father's Day barbecue tomorrow. Marge is planning something special. Ribs and her famous slaw." The contrast between the timeline he presented to authorities and the one suggested by his own digital communications added another layer of unease. By all accounts, the Sunday barbecue went ahead without incident. It was a sunny day, unseasonably warm for mid-June, and the backyard was full of laughter, the smell of meat on the grill, and relatives sipping cold beers under a pop-up canopy. But Marge was conspicuously absent. When asked, Harold told the group that she had made a last-minute trip to visit her sister Carol in Astoria. That would turn out to be a significant misstep. Ellen, suspicious and confused, called her aunt mid-barbecue to say hello, and quickly learned that Carol hadn't spoken to Marge in over 3 weeks. When confronted later, Harold dismissed it as a mix-up, saying, "She must have changed her plans last minute. You know how she is." But it wasn't convincing. 2 days had passed since Marge supposedly went for a walk and vanished, and her husband had neither searched the trail, contacted local hospitals, nor reached out to friends to ask if they'd seen her. Only on Monday morning did he contact the police to officially file the missing person report, a full 48 hours after he claimed to have last seen her. At the time, police documented his demeanor as controlled and orderly, and he offered to help with the search effort, even volunteering to walk the perimeter of the nearby trails. But the concern didn't feel organic. Weeks later, as investigators expanded their search radius far beyond Cedar Ridge, 2 hikers in the Santiam State Forest stumbled upon a shallow, hastily dug grave. It was July 6th. What they initially thought was a buried deer carcass turned out to be the decomposing body of a woman wrapped in a blue tarp and a flamingo-patterned shower curtain, tightly wound with zip ties and covered in disturbed soil. The location was 93 miles from the Green residence. Dental records confirmed it was Marge Green. Her injuries told a gruesome story: severe blunt force trauma to the back of the head, likely inflicted by a hammer or similar object, 3 broken ribs, and bruising consistent with someone who had fought for her life. Lime residue was found both around the burial site and beneath her fingernails, a forensic detail that would later be used to match the specific chemical composition to the brand Harold purchased. Inside the trunk of Harold's Ford Explorer, crime scene techs found a single long strand of gray-blonde hair, consistent with Marge's, and a faint smear of blood beneath the trunk mat that tested positive for her DNA. Phone records, too, told a damning story. Harold's cell phone pinged off a remote tower near Santiam Forest between 10:11 p.m. and 1:42 a.m. on the night of June 17th, completely inconsistent with his statement that he hadn't left the house after dinner. It was this phone data that prompted investigators to secure a full forensic warrant, unlocking a trove of damning evidence. Browser searches for "How long does lime speed up decomposition?", a deleted Google Maps route to Santiam Forest, and most telling of all, email communications with a woman named Denise Taylor. Denise, 52, was a widow living in Bend, Oregon, and had been involved with Harold for 6 years, something he had concealed from his entire family. The messages recovered, many of them encrypted and recovered from cloud backups, revealed a long-standing fantasy of starting over together. In one, dated May 22, 2023, Harold wrote, "You're the one thing that still makes sense. Everything else is noise. I need this clean. No strings. That clean break now looked more like a calculated execution. As investigators built their timeline, the pieces fell into place with chilling clarity. Harold had waited until the early morning hours of June 17th, bludgeoned Marge in their bedroom while she was likely still in bed, wrapped her body, stored it temporarily in their garage freezer, evidenced by small traces of hair and blood discovered behind the freezer's drainage grate, and then transported her body that night to a forest he knew well from past camping trips. The next morning, as her body lay hidden in the earth, Harold served ribs and potato salad to his family, laughing over drinks in the very yard where he had committed what prosecutors would soon call an act of extraordinary deception and moral rot. When Harold Green was arrested on the morning of July 21, 2023, he offered no resistance, no protest, and no visible emotion. Detectives arrived at his Cedar Ridge home with a warrant, and he opened the door dressed in his usual plaid shirt and khakis, appearing almost relieved. "I figured this day would come," he reportedly said as they cuffed him. The charges were severe: second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and obstruction of justice. In interviews following the arrest, detectives described his demeanor as flat, detached, and resigned, and it quickly became clear that the man who had once been considered the steady center of his family had been leading a double life that none of them could have imagined. The deeper investigators dug, the more a portrait emerged of a man who had grown bitter and restless behind his calm exterior. In emails, text messages, and statements provided by Denise Taylor, who cooperated fully once contacted, it was revealed that Harold had been contemplating a way out of his marriage since at least 2019. Denise told investigators that Harold had assured her the situation would resolve itself, and that he often spoke of Marge in passive, almost clinical terms, describing her as a duty, a weight, or a legacy I didn't choose. But Denise, while shocked by what he ultimately did, insisted she had no idea he was capable of murder, and prosecutors confirmed that she faced no charges due to a lack of evidence tying her to the planning or aftermath. The trial began on March 11, 2024, in Marion County Circuit Court and immediately drew public attention. Local news stations covered it wall-to-wall, and true crime blogs dissected every detail. The prosecution opened with a powerful theme: that Harold Green had not snapped, but planned. They introduced a wealth of digital evidence, the damning search history, the phone location data, the email exchanges, and paired it with forensic testimony tying the lime, tarp, and shower curtain directly to the Green household. The flamingo pattern on the curtain, which had matched a set found in the guest bathroom linen closet, became something of a grotesque motif for the prosecution's narrative, a banal, everyday detail turned horrific by its use in concealing a corpse. Marge's journal entries, submitted into evidence by Ellen Green, were read aloud in court, including one from June 14th, just 3 days before her death. "If anything happens to me, please know I didn't leave willingly." That line, chilling in hindsight, hung over the courtroom like a ghost. Ellen and Stephen both testified against their father, their testimonies measured but devastating. Ellen spoke about her mother's growing fear, her confusion over Harold's coldness, and the overwhelming horror she felt when she realized her father had smiled and laughed at the barbecue knowing exactly where her mother's body lay. Stephen, more reserved, described a father who was always emotionally remote, but said he never imagined he was capable of something this grotesque. The defense attempted to argue that Marge's death was accidental, that an argument had turned physical, she had fallen, and Harold had panicked. But that version of events couldn't hold under the weight of planning, the materials purchased in advance, the forest burial, and the staged deception in the days that followed. When Harold took the stand, his testimony offered no clarity. He spoke softly, deflected questions, and refused to address his motive directly. When asked point-blank by the prosecution why he didn't call 911 after Marge's supposed fall, he replied only, "I don't know. I didn't think it would matter." The jury deliberated for just over 7 hours before returning a unanimous verdict on April 25, 2024. Guilty on all counts. During sentencing, Judge Amanda Kellerman called Harold's actions a betrayal of unimaginable depth and said that his choice to stage a Father's Day celebration the morning after a brutal murder showed a moral emptiness that defies comprehension. He was sentenced to 35 years to life without the possibility of parole until 2059, effectively a life sentence given his age. The Green home was sold later that year. Neighbors said it took months before anyone was willing to buy it, and Ellen founded the Marjorie Green Foundation in her mother's name, focused on providing resources to women trapped in emotionally coercive or high-control relationships. Denise Taylor withdrew from public life entirely. Reporters noted that she moved out of Bend in August 2024 and has not been heard from since. The community of Cedar Ridge remains shaken. To them, Harold Green wasn't just a killer. He was the man who smiled over charcoal smoke while his wife lay buried in a forest, the host of a barbecue that doubled as a funeral no one knew they were attending.